of us could use some help in this area to some degree. I think there's probably lots for us to learn in this particular area, and interestingly enough, there's been a lot of studies done by industrial psychologists around time management and priority management, and so a lot of what I'll be sharing with you today, you've already sort of been maybe aware of. There may be some new pieces or tips in today's session that we'll talk about. Generally speaking, I'd really like to share with you some of the more forward-thinking thoughts around time management and what studies are showing us about time management. So there may be a few things that you hadn't or you thought were the right way to go about things, and maybe there's a different way to look at it. So why don't we jump in and just talk about what those things might be. Now, here we go. So, an interesting quote by Peter Strupp: time only seems to matter when it's running out, and isn't that so true? We can definitely figure out that time is something you notice when you don't have enough of it. And it's important to note that this is, again, there's a psychological component to this. So the interactions that we have in terms of how we respond to time when it's running out, and that actually can cause stress, that can cause a lot of issues with your sympathetic system, which is the one that kind of houses stress, if you will. And it can actually lead to physical issues. You can actually have, you can generate angina, you can generate issues, physical issues, medical issues that are a result of too much stress based on time and how you manage time, or how well you manage it or how well you don't manage it. And so there's some real interesting medical studies around the importance of doing this, and particularly from a work perspective. So that's going to be the basis of a lot of the conversation that we have today. So what does your vicious work time cycle look like? And I don't mean to imply that everyone has a vicious work time cycle. However, there are a lot of us that don't manage our time or don't have the ability to manage our time in a way that is helpful to us. And therefore, we end up having this cycle. So everyone has jobs that are, really challenging, require a lot of energy, and require, there's more things to do than there is time to do them, and that's not an uncommon issue for most workers in this modern era. So where does all this come from? Why do we have so much time pressure all of the time? The pressure to get things done, pressure to move the needle, pressure to have the answers. All of these come from different areas, whether it's your boss, your clients, outside stakeholders, internal stakeholders. And, I've always said this thing that sometimes, if your priority is not someone else's, if you're feeling the crunch and someone else isn't, then we go about creating crisis for another so that we can get what we need. So crisis mentality, and that's kind of the way that we tend to operate in North America in terms of how we approach work. So everything's important. So we do have this sort of social crisis mentality. And then another component of this cycle that adds to the cycle, and we call it individual heroics. So meaning someone that's taking on everything or doesn't necessarily feel that somebody else can do it as well, as quickly, as efficiently. So you end up piling a lot of things on your plate, and it's kind of self-induced, right? And then lastly, constant task switching and interruptions. So moving from one task to another and never really getting anything done in one task and figuring out, okay, I've got to move this over because now this is urgent, and then now someone else has asked for something else. And the constant interruptions, people dropping in, the phone ringing, urgent emails. There's so many things that come into our day that help us really contribute to, just one second, please. Hold on, everybody. Sorry about the interruption, everybody. I just received a note that today we're working on managing priorities and time, well, mostly managing priorities. And I've really combined managing time and priorities. So I hope that's okay with everybody. There's two components to this session. And so I don't want anyone to think that you're sitting in the wrong session. I'm sort of tackling both of these things at the same time. So is that okay with everybody? If you could just let me know if that's okay that we move in this direction?
Yep, it's fine.
Yes. Okay. Sorry for any confusion, folks. But I really thought that these two pieces go together. So I'll continue on. So figuring out what time you have and managing priorities around time. Thank you, Cindy, for mentioning. What are the things that we need to do and how we need to do them and the time that we have to do these things, and what is the criteria for us to figure out what are the things that I need to be doing in the amount of time that I have. We do spend a lot of time trying to cram a lot of important things into a finite amount of time. And so that's a bit of an issue because, as I mentioned earlier, what comes out of that is the stress of trying to figure out how to get it all done. And then, of course, we all know what the stress leads to. So time is an important component, and I'm also going to talk about priority management as it relates to time as well. So we've all been in this room before, or some version of it, figuring out what it is that as a team that we need to do, what are the priorities, and what are the things that are going to move the needle for the department or the organization or whatever stakeholder group you're working within. So here's an interesting point. 70% of strategic failures are due to poor execution by leadership. Now, if you're in leadership, please don't take this personally. My point is not to say that all leaders are not great at execution. But there is a lot of study and there are a lot of data points that speak to the fact that execution is really part of why things, certain initiatives tend to fail. So the concept is there, the concept is strong, maybe even the planning is good to a certain degree. But then when it comes to execution, that's where things fall down. And so this is also, again, where time and priority management comes into play. Underestimating the amount of time that one needs to execute on something is something that leads to poor execution. Not understanding all of the components. And then second to that is the prioritization of all of the pieces of a strategic plan, project, whatever it is, and ensuring that you prioritize things in the right order, and then on top of that, given enough time for good execution on those pieces. So it's really where the time and the priority pieces intersect and come to execution. So, 70%, at some point, we probably would have found ourselves in that 70%, that time where we really needed to get something to happen, whether it's a large project or a small project, but weren't quite able to do it to the level that we wanted to because maybe one of those pieces wasn't thought through enough, how much time was required and how we prioritized the work that we really needed to focus on. So let's talk about the things that are wasting our time. And I'm going to suggest that many of us have maybe been in a workshop or have had the discussions or have had training around time management. But we all have to deal with this on a daily basis. So, you know, the constant interruptions during the day, and not to say that some of them are not wanted. If a friend drops in and wants to chat for a bit, that's actually a nice break from you know, the way that your day is moving along. The question is, how often does that happen and how long do you engage? And is that where you want to place your priority for the day? You know, where does that fit in? Being handcuffed to the telephone, like I said, unexpected visitors or wanders. We're all bogged down with reports all the time. Reports is probably one of the things that I hear most from people that is made a priority for them, but is not necessarily always the things that are going to move the needle for the business. And so some reports, the question being, how necessary are they? Do I need to be reviewing or working or creating that report? We do a lot of data analysis and a lot of report taking and data gathering. And the question is, are we making the best use of that information? So there's a lot of question marks around that for a lot of professionals that we work with. And another piece of that, I should say separate to that really, is junk mail and just dealing with junk mail. You know, if you think about the amount of time, and hopefully you've got a strong, you know, firewall in your organization where you don't have to deal with junk mail, but sometimes it seeps in, and just getting rid of it or dealing with it, that's just a minor time waster, but it's a time waster nonetheless. And lastly, and I would argue probably most importantly, is meetings without agendas, where we're getting together because we're supposed to every week, but we don't really have clarity around what it is that we need to focus on today. And meetings without agendas is, in our organization, is an absolute no-no. There needs to be some understanding about what we're coming together for. And if that means we're coming together for 10 minutes, great. If that means we're coming together for half an hour, great. But let's all be clear at the top of the meeting what it is that we want to talk about. So having an agenda and really doing our best to stick to it, I'm not sure if that's a minor time waster, but it's a time waster. It might be in the major category. And here are the major time wasters. So our own procrastination, our own, you know, I will say that I am absolutely guilty of this. I tend to tackle the things that I like to do first, which is really not you know, the ideal way for me to attack my day. Ideally, you come in and the things that are A, the most urgent, and B, the hardest for you to do, the most strenuous on you, are typically the things you want to try to attack first thing in the day. Being afraid to delegate, so giving the work away, being afraid to not being seen as someone that can handle everything, or giving the work away to someone and you're not fully sure if they are capable or have the capacity to do it. Us not wanting to say no. We never want to let people down. We never want to be the one that's not the team player. And in that, we tend to say yes to a lot of things and not always to our own advantage or even to the company's advantage. So really think through what you say yes to and what you say no to. Low self-esteem, and again, the time waster is you spend a lot of time in the space of I can't do it, I can't do it, I can't do it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And lastly, having those problems with objectives and priorities, not being clear on what it is you were expected to do in the first place. So you go in one direction, you take that information to someone, they say, well, that's not exactly what I wanted, when you could have maybe just asked the question on the front end and cleared that up. So, or not understanding where does this thing fit on the list of things that I need to get done, or the list of things that are important for someone else, for your boss, for instance. Maybe you're tackling things that are of less priority, when really you should be more focused on the things that have more priority, but you didn't ask the question. So those are some of the things that waste our time, and there may be others that could go on this list, but we really need to figure out what are the things that we need to be doing in the day that need to be more important and higher on the list of things that we need to focus on. So Goals, priority, and planning. So there's 4 good questions right there. So why am I doing this? And why is not the question, why you? But why is the question, what is the impact? Why am I doing this? What does it change? What does it improve? What does it make more efficient, more effective, and the like? So why am I doing this thing? And then what is the goal of doing it? Is it to create more efficiency? Is it to, increase internal engagement? Ask yourself, what is the purpose of this task? So whether it's a report or whether it's any sort of initiative that you're doing, ask yourself, what is the goal? Particularly if you think, I'm not sure this makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure this is a high priority. These are 4 great questions to ask. Yeah, you might want to start with asking yourself, but if you can't come up with answers, then who's the next person for you to take your concerns to? So why will I succeed is not a personal question, but it's what are the resources that I can utilize to make this initiative happen? Why will I succeed is you need to really think about what are the things that will be required of me to do so. I'll succeed because I have the most information. I'll succeed because I have the team with the competency to do so. So ask yourself those kinds of questions. Why is a great question? And what happens if I choose not to do so? Admittedly, we don't always have the opportunity to choose. But ask yourself, if this didn't happen, what would happen? If this didn't get done, what would happen? And I tell you, if the answer is nothing, then there's something questionable about the task that you're focused on in the first place. So from a time and priority management perspective, I suggest that many of us have probably seen this grid, this matrix, but I thought it was worth reviewing anyway. Because this does bring together your time plus your priorities and helps you understand, where am I spending most of my time? If you did an analysis of your full day, if you took all of the tasks that on a typical day that you go through and you plotted them in this grid, what would that look like? So I still do want to go through the grid and just talk about each of the things within the grid so that it can help you put more thought to the things that you're doing and why you're doing them. So, first grid, and if I can go back for a second, so that's urgent and important. So the things that are urgent and important are the things you need to do first. They are without question the most important things, and important from a priority perspective and urgent from a time perspective. So this is the cross-section of priority and time. So important and urgent, that's the stuff you've got to focus on. Those are the no question, got to get it done. Things in that quadrant are the things that are not questionable and need to be attacked first. But then you move over to important and not urgent. So still a priority, important for the business, important for the team, important for the department. But they don't have the urgency. The timeline around it is not something that it doesn't need to be done tomorrow. So that's where you're going to do a lot of your quality work, right? So that's where you have time and space to plan and think things through. But they're still critical components to what it is that you do. But then we move down into quadrant 3, so not important but urgent. So that's where things can get really confusing. And oftentimes things in this quadrant are things that are not important to you necessarily, but maybe important to somebody else, and they've created the urgency around it. So then the question is this something you really should be doing? Does it truly have importance or urgency. So that's the quadrant where you're going to want to start asking more questions around where does this initiative belong. And because somebody brings you urgency around something that's not necessarily important, it can create the deception that it's actually important and urgent. That's where you want to start asking questions. And then, of course, the last quadrant is not important and not urgent. Those are your time wasters. Those are the things that we should have delegated but didn't, or maybe just not do at all, but continue to do. So I want to explain that quadrant, but I do want to go into each of all of these and just go into a little bit more depth in them. So the urgent and important quadrant, again, this is where you want to spend your time. So when we talk about prioritizing and priority management, this is where we want to make sure that we're spending our time. So this is where we manage, produce, and bring our experience and judgment into responding to things in a fast and quick manner. You know, if it's, you know, a client that has had an issue with, you know, a policy and they're very concerned. So it's important because it matters to the client and it's urgent. Maybe it's urgent because there's some time constraint around that. So that's going to end up in that first block, and that's important. And it might be important for you to think about what are the types of things that belong in that block. So it's really important for you to be thoughtful about what it is that belongs there. So the next quadrant is less urgent, and I mentioned earlier that that's the quadrant of quality. This is where you're going to do most of your best work. So it's important, but it's not urgent, so that gives me the space and time from a priority perspective to really work on that. So this is an important piece because I don't think enough people spend as much time there as they should because we become distracted by the other two quadrants, which we'll talk about in a moment. So here's where you're doing your long-range planning and anticipating, your strategic planning. This is where you're doing things that build the team. This is where you do things where you're learning. So all of those important things that don't have a time crunch necessarily around them. If you don't pay attention to this quadrant, a lot of these things end up moving back over into the urgent and important quadrant. So if we're not paying attention to that, things will seep over to the left into the quadrant where it now is important and urgent. And now I have no choice but to spend my time on it. But if you spend time earlier, or sorry, if you spend time working on those things and being planful about it, they never end up in that urgent, important quadrant. So the more time you spend there, the less time you have in quadrant one. So the next quadrant is urgent but not important. The big question here is this where I need to start delegating? Is this something that I need to have my hands on, or is it something that I can push to another colleague, to a subordinate, and the like? Or instruct who's bringing it to you how to do it so that you're not even really taking the ball. You're supporting, but you're not owning. And I think that's another area where a lot of people that I work with come to me and say, you know, whenever anybody brings something to me, I own it. And that's not necessarily always appropriate depending on what the issue is. The noise of urgency creates the illusion of importance. And I think we need to separate the timing of it from the priority of it. And then last, again, that last quadrant, the quadrant of waste. Sometimes we go there deliberately just for some downtime. And not to say there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with looking for this escape time as long as you know what it is, know why you're there, and know why you're doing it. and that it's not something that gets out of hand in terms of you're spending too much time in this quadrant, you're spending too much time, talking with friends, online, doing things that initially are there to give you a break, which is good. If you're there too long, it becomes problematic. That's another reason why if you're spending more time here, you have less time for the things that are of greater priority for you, which creates more activities in those other boxes. So again, it's good for mindful rest, but not good if you're spending too much time there, and just the awareness of how much time you might be doing these things that aren't going to move your needle. It's important for you to understand that and be able to manage it. So if we were to rejig that model, this is what it would look like. So a little bit of time on what's urgent, and stuff that's important but not urgent, that's where you're spending the bulk of your time in an ideal world. And then again, not important but urgent, we're doing much less of that, and then even less on the time wasters. So this is ideally what it looks like. So if you looked at how your day maps out, does it look like this? Maybe, maybe not. And if so, what can you do to shift that? Let's talk about the power of focus. So there was a really interesting study done in 2010 around the number of goals that a professional has compared to the number of goals that were completed with excellence. So getting something done is one thing. Doing it well is something else. I think we all know that. So if you have 2 to 3 strategic priorities, most people in the study are able to do 2 or 3 of those strategic priorities with excellence. But look how the numbers change based on how many more goals you have. So if you have 4 to 10 goals, the level of excellence you are able to achieve on each of those goals goes down. You can't do 4 to 10 things all with a level of excellency. Something's going to have to give. Now that number is even more interesting. So if you have too many goals, the likelihood of you achieving any of them with any level of excellency is 0. Now there may be some superstars out there that can get a certain level of excellency with maybe a few of the things if they have 11 or 12 goals. But most of us can't do that. The average professional can't do that. So the question is, and it's quite easily answered just by looking at these numbers, you can't have too many strategic priorities. So of the priorities that you have, which ones are critical? And that's what we all need to ask ourselves. I don't know a lot of people with 11 or 12 key priorities that they have to achieve, but 4 to 10 seems more reasonable. And so the question becomes, can you live with 1 or 2 being excellent, or can you be even strategic and say one of these 2 will be excellent, and we need to do our best with, or I need to do my best with the remainder? Is that acceptable? Because if it's not, then the question becomes, all right, what are the ones that I put off? What are the ones that I'm going to prioritize? And if you just, look at it based on these numbers, how are you going to manage that? I think that this is a really great illustration of how important it is to prioritize the work that we do, and what is the work that needs our attention, our most attention, to be achieved with any certain level of excellency. Interesting study. So I really like this saying. How long a minute is depends on which side of the bathroom door you're on. So true. So look, this is all about your priorities versus somebody else's priorities. And how do you put that into perspective? So many of you know that I work with clients. Some of the clients I work with have just experienced job loss. And one of the major frustrations that my clients have is the fact that when they're networking and they're reaching out to people, and even people they know quite well, people don't get back to you. People don't get back to you sometimes. Imagine that. And for a lot of my clients, it's the first time in their career that they're asking themselves, or even experiencing this. And my response to that is, it's likely that people have not gotten back to you before. The difference is your level of urgency is now heightened, so you really notice it. When you were in your job and everything was going great and you placed a call to Dan, and I hope there's no Dan on the phone, we placed a call to Dan and Dan didn't get back to you, you might be surprised, you probably noticed it, but it certainly wasn't the end of the world. Now you're out of a job and you're reaching out to Dan and Dan doesn't get back to you, that has a lot more significance all of a sudden. And so, I say to my clients, because Dan is your priority, it does not mean that you're his priority. And that oftentimes is a bit of a, yeah, I get that. I get that. But it's no different whether we're dealing with people that have experienced job loss or you in your current roles, for instance. Your priority may not be somebody else's priority. So how do you create a level of urgency with other people? What does that look like? How do you impress upon people that something's important to you and hopefully it's important to them as well, without insinuating that they're dropping the ball or insinuating that they're not doing their job or they're not getting back to you? And I mean, we always want to be polite, but we need what we need when we need it. And so there are a lot of interesting tactics. There's coaching tactics. There's all kinds of tactics around creation of urgency. But before you go there, you've got to do your own sort of self-analysis to figure out, is this something in which I want to create the urgency for somebody else? Is everything you need urgent? Likely not. So when it is, how do you create that urgency? So I always talk about intent and risk when it comes to urgency. So for instance, if you're leaving a message for someone and you need them to get back to you. Hi Dan, this is April. Was really hoping to chat with you. I've got an issue with the client and really great to get back to me. All right. Hopefully Dan will get back to you. But if Dan doesn't, what could you have changed about that message to help Dan want to get back to you a bit sooner? And this would apply to emails, phone calls, anything. So the two things that I talk about in communication is, give Dan the intent of the phone call. So what it is that you're intending to do, and what's the risk if it doesn't happen? So the same message being, hi Dan, this is April, hope all is well. Working with a client right now who doesn't have all the information to so that we can close on their policy, and they need it in place ASAP. You're the only person that has this information that I can get it from, so I was really hoping that you would connect with me so that I can finish, close off this file with the client. So now I've told Dan my intent. I've also created urgency because he's the only one that can get me the information. For some, that may sound a bit pushy. But if it's urgent, sometimes it requires that. It requires a level of communication that has them understand and that you've given them enough information so that Dan, at a minimum, can make the decision, oh my gosh, I got to get back to April right away. And you created a bit of ownership for Dan, because now Dan realizes I'm the only one that can give her the information. Now, this by no means guarantees Dan will get back to you, but it's a way to communicate priority and urgency to someone that doesn't sound panicked, but has them understand what's at stake. And really, that's about all you can do. What more can you do? So that's just one of the little strategies that I use and that I coach clients to use when you're really needing people to respond to you. I like to think that most people are good at responding, but not everybody is. And other people have other priorities, so I get it. Your job is to get your priority pushed up on their list of things to do. So in the next session, I'm going to dig in much more onto those priorities. I'm going to talk more about how you're setting priorities and the criteria for priority setting that you might want to consider. And there are actually a few different schools of thought on priority setting and the criteria for priority setting. There's a couple of different ways to look at it that I'll be sharing with you as well. And then again, at the end of the day, this all ties into time management. So imagine if you're focused on the things that are a priority, and then secondary to that, you're managing on the things that are important. And then lastly, you fill in with some of the things that maybe are less urgent but need to get done. If you're able to contextualize that and wrap that around your specific work that you do, there's a good likelihood that you'll be able to create some behaviors that will be beneficial to you and advantageous to you from a time and priority management perspective. So that's part one. And then in a couple of weeks, or maybe even next week, I'm not sure of the date, but IBANS will certainly send out the date for you for the next session. We'll dig deeper into the priority piece. So as always, I ask the question, does anybody have any questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Can you go back through the slides one more time?
Do you want to go through all of them, or?
Yeah, just a quick glance from the beginning.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay.
Okay.
So the vicious time cycle again, so our work cycles and what are the things that get in the way of good time management and priority management? 70% of strategic failures are due to poor execution. So again, it's about the intersection of time and priority and how do these things get executed, and sometimes things aren't, there's not enough time given to the right priorities sometimes, and that can lead to failure of projects and the like. The minor time wasters, interruptions, handcuffed to the telephone, unexpected or unwanted visitors, needless reports. Not to say all reports are needless, but some of them may be. And meetings without agenda, which is a big time waster. When you go to the meeting because you're supposed to, because it's a weekly meeting or a quarterly meeting, but there's not enough of a tight agenda, and that agenda is not managed well, and so you end up going over, not talking about the things that are critical to operations. Major time wasters is our own procrastination and holding off on the things that we like to do, being afraid to delegate, not having the courage to say no at times. It's hard. I don't want that to sound as though it's being judged, but it can be hard to say no. And problems with objectives and priorities, and then just having low self-esteem and sort of swirling in your own, lack of belief in that you can do something in the first place. Goals and priority planning. So the first thing you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about priorities are, why am I doing this? What is the end goal? What am I trying to achieve, or what are we trying to achieve? What are the reasons that you'll succeed, and what happens if you choose not to do it? So what's the risk? The 4 quadrants around important and urgency. So important and urgent, do them first. Not urgent, that's where your quality work is. Planning, timefulness, mindfulness. Not important and urgent can be confused with important and urgent, so be careful to do a real assessment. If somebody comes to you with something that's important to them but may not be as important to you, is it something you delegate? Do you take it on anyway? So what do you do with that? And then the not important, not urgent are the time wasters. Those are the things that we know are just not moving your agenda. So then do first. Again, those are the things that are urgent, and if they are procrastinated on, you're going to find yourself in real trouble. Less urgent, this is the quality quadrant, so this is where hopefully you're spending most of your time, and if you don't spend a lot of good time there, you're going to move things over to urgent and important. So you really want to make sure you spend most of your time there. And delegate, so these are things that may appear to be urgent and may even appear to be important, but are not necessarily so. So you really want to make sure that you're understanding, does this need to be on my list of priorities? If not, why not? And what else can be done with it if it shouldn't be on my list of priorities? So this is the area where you may have to be ruthless. And then lastly, the don't do. So those are time wasters, the things you need to do less of, unless you're there purposefully to have a break, to have a mental break, which is great. You just need to know why you're there. So then this is what good time management looks like. So again, you're spending most of your time doing the things that are important but don't necessarily have the urgency. But before you're doing those, you do get to the things that are urgent. And then watch out for the things that fall into deception that are not important and urgent, and make sure that you analyze that well and do spend the least amount of your time in the not important, not urgent quadrant. So then the power of focus is really around understanding that the fewer goals you have, the better chance you have on doing them with excellence. And the more goals you have, that decreases your ability to do things excellently because your mind is spread too far to do anything with enough depth for it to be excellent. And then finally, it was about, we want to go deeper into priority management and what makes something a priority. And so it is about perspective to a certain degree. So some things we just know are priorities, and then other things, again, you have to analyze because someone's bringing it to you. Depending on which side of the door you're on, your perspective around a priority may be different. So it may mean stepping back from your own perspective and saying, it's important to this person, should this be important to me? There is that saying that, what's interesting to my boss is fascinating to me. So on a certain degree, you have to think about who's your stakeholder, what's important to them, and then assess what's the level of urgency or importance that you need to give that particular thing. So does that help? I just reviewed. I hope I didn't go too quickly. Does that help?
Great. Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, so like I said, next week we're going to dig deeper into this, so I hope you'll all join me back there as well. And I appreciate you asking the question. I was happy to go through those again. So everybody have a great Monday, and we'll talk again next week.